Welcome to The Explainer. I'm genuinely so thrilled you're joining us today because, well, we are going to unpack what's honestly one of the most fascinating concepts in all of human history. We're talking about the true origins of society, law, and morality. How exactly did we go from a world of total, absolute chaos to the highly structured lives we live today? To figure that out, we're going to look through the lens of a brilliant, if let's be real, slightly pessimistic, 17th century philosopher named Thomas Hobbes. Let's get right into it.
So, I want you to start by asking yourself a pretty deeply unsettling question. What would the world actually look like without morality? Just imagine it. A scenario with zero rules, no police, no courts, no societal judgment whatsoever. What would you do? And maybe more importantly, what would your neighbors do? This isn't just some wild thought experiment, by the way. This terrifying, incredibly chaotic scenario is actually the very foundation of Thomas Hobbes' entire worldview.
Here is our logical journey for today. First, we'll look at the basis of society. Then, we dive into the state of nature, followed by the social contract solution. After that, we'll meet the mighty Leviathan state. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at some flaws in the contract.
All right, Section 1, the basis of society. Because, before we can fully grasp how things go terribly wrong, we really need to understand how they are actually supposed to work.
The core concept we need to tackle here is Contractarianism. Now, this school of thought essentially argues that human conduct is only considered ethical if it follows the norms laid down in a contract between parties. Think about it. Every single society is based on some kind of contract. Sometimes it's completely implicit, like who does what chores in a family, and sometimes it's very explicit. When this contract happens directly between the state and its citizens, we call it a social contract. It's actually a pretty simple trade when you boil it down. People are expected to follow the laws, and in return, the state is expected to serve and protect the people.
So what happens when that contract simply doesn't exist? That brings us to Section 2, the state of nature. To really understand Thomas Hobbes, you kind of have to understand his personal trauma. He lived through the absolute horror of the English Civil War and even witnessed the beheading of King Charles I. He absolutely detested violence, and as you can imagine, this heavily shaped his deeply pessimistic view of what a world without rules would look like.
Hobbes fundamentally believed that without morality, we would exist in what he called a state of nature. He famously, and rather grimly, described this as a place of continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of humans solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, short, murderous, selfish. I mean, wow, he envisioned a truly terrible place completely stripped of art, literature, commerce, industry, or culture.
But wait a minute, why would it actually be that bad? Surely, if left to our own devices, humans wouldn't just instantly turn on each other, right? Like, why wouldn't we just peacefully farm our own land and leave each other alone? Well, Hobbes had a few very specific ideas about that. Let's look at the logical drivers behind this hypothetical horror show.
The real issue, according to Hobbes, is the toxic combination of human nature and our environment. He pointed out 4 compounding causes for this total chaos. First, humans have these endless, desperate desires for things like food, clothing, shelter, power, and glory. Second, there's an extreme scarcity of these resources. They just don't exist in absolute abundance. Third, there's a relative equality in human power, meaning no one is so biologically dominant that they're completely safe from everyone else. And fourth, we all exhibit a predominant sense of self-interest. So you put all that together, we're all relatively equal, totally self-interested, and fiercely fighting over very scarce resources, and life just becomes this continuous, violent struggle, a literal, permanent state of war.
And this leads directly to what Hobbes called the right of nature. In a world before laws or contracts even exist, there's absolutely zero moral obligation constraining our behavior. Self-preservation completely justifies using force or even fraud just to defend ourselves. In this incredibly dark state, violence isn't seen as evil. It is actually a perfectly rational choice for survival. Literally, the only limit to what you can do is the physical power of the people trying to stop you.
I know, that sounds incredibly bleak, doesn't it? But fortunately for us, rational humans really want to escape this miserable state of war. Moving on to Section 3, the social contract solution.
Hobbes argued that because the state of nature is just so undeniably miserable, human beings, being the rational creatures that we are, will try to avoid war and ensure peace. He called these practical imperatives the laws of nature. And the foundational rule here is actually remarkably simple. Do not treat others in ways we would not have them treat us. Morality then simply becomes the agreed-upon, mutually advantageous conventions that make living together peacefully possible. In other words, we create morality, we don't just naturally discover it.
Adopting a social contract makes incredible logical sense for pretty much everyone, and there are 5 really satisfying reasons why this theory is so wildly attractive. First off, it demystifies ethics by showing it's honestly just about all of us living well together. Second, it proves morality is objective. We don't kill or lie because doing those things directly threaten the very fabric of society. Third, these rules aren't designed to unnecessarily interfere in people's personal private lives. Fourth, the theory doesn't rely on some fantasy that humans are purely altruistic. It realistically assumes we are self-interested. And finally, it brilliantly gives us a reason to actually be moral, because morality is fundamentally in our own self-interest. It just works.
But, okay, there is a catch, and it's a big one. It's really not rational to comply with all these nice agreements if you can't trust the other guy to do the same. Which brings us to Section 4, the mighty Leviathan state. Let's look at how this builds into the physical structure of society. At the very top, we have the state, completely managing the delicate balance between resources and human rights at the base. Hobbes argued that it is absolutely not rational to comply with our societal agreements unless a coercive power forces us to. Otherwise, someone could easily just fake their agreement and violate the accord the exact second your back is turned. Therefore, society desperately requires a massive, overwhelmingly strong entity, a Leviathan state, to enforce the laws. And notice something absolutely critical here. In this model, human rights are granted conditionally by the state. They are not absolute. This grants the Leviathan state a profound moral obligation. Because it was explicitly created by the social contract, the state has the ultimate moral foundation to enforce laws, even entirely against the will of its subjects. Hobbes actually advocated for a state so incredibly powerful, with such absolute authority, that citizens literally cannot revolt against it. Why? Well, because the state can logically compromise the rights of a few for the sake of the much larger good, which, remember, is societal stability, peace, and security.
Now, if the idea of handing over absolute, unquestionable power to a massive government sounds a bit alarming to you, well, you definitely aren't alone. Let's get into Section 5, Flaws in the Contract. It's time to examine the major holes in Hobbes' 17th century logic.
The single most glaring flaw is what we call the free rider problem. The contract theory does a great job answering why we collectively should be moral, but it really struggles to answer why I individually should be moral in secret. Seriously, why shouldn't I be immoral if I know I can get away with it? If society is generally following the rules and functioning well, I could actually benefit the most by secretly breaking those rules and just reaping the rewards for myself.
And that right there creates a massive prisoner's dilemma. Now, Hobbes' answer to this is that we must penalize non-cooperation using those powerful coercive agencies we just talked about. But here's the obvious question: who polices the police? Relying on absolute power gives rise to the totally intractable problem of corruption and massive injustice within government and law enforcement themselves. Furthermore, a lot of modern critics argue that Hobbes' view of human nature was just overly negative. Remember, he was deeply traumatized by the widespread crimes, murders, and brutal civil wars of his specific time period.
We can see this really clearly when we objectively contrast Hobbes' framework with modern virtue ethics. On one side, Hobbes' Leviathan demands absolute power, based on a very pessimistic view of humans, basically concluding that a strong government is always the best option. Virtue ethics, on the exact other hand, advocates for limited government. It holds a much more positive view of humanity, believing firmly that humans actually can, and often do, behave completely selflessly.
And you know, history is absolutely full of thinkers who prove humanity's capacity for good. Look at the teachings of the Gita, which heavily emphasize profound selflessness. Look at Vivekananda, who taught that service to a living being, Jiva, is directly service to the divine, Shiva. Look at Gandhi. He diametrically opposed Hobbes, firmly stating that self-governance and the absolutely least amount of government is the best government. Or even going way back to Aristotle, who fundamentally viewed humans not as brutal, selfish animals, but as rational creatures fully capable of deep charity and kindness towards the weaker sections of society. Which brings us to a final, incredibly provocative thought I want to leave you pondering today. Thomas Hobbes undoubtedly showed us that without some form of agreement, society really does risk collapsing into a state of war. But given the modern preference for limited government and our historically proven capacity for selflessness, in today's world, is the mighty absolute Leviathan actually still necessary? How much state control do we truly need to keep the peace? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you next time.